The ambulance crew wanted to put a neck brace on me. My wife stopped them. "Oh, please," she sighed, standing in the foyer with her arms folded. "He missed one step, not a war." The younger paramedic looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, he hit his head. He hits his head every time he tries to fix something." My daughter laughed from the staircase. "Mom, don't waste everyone's time." Then she looked directly at me. If Dad was actually dying, he wouldn't be groaning. He'd finally be quiet. Both of them laughed. The paramedic helped me onto the stretcher. As they wheeled me toward the front door, my wife called after them. "If he starts complaining in the ambulance, just give him a mirror. He loves feeling sorry for himself." The neighbors standing outside pretended not to hear. I closed my eyes, not because my back hurt, because I suddenly understood something. For years, I'd believed I was living with people who no longer loved me. I was wrong. Love disappearing is one thing. Respect disappearing is far more dangerous. My name isn't important, not yet, because for the next few hours, even I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The emergency room doctor ordered scans, no broken bones, a severe concussion, 3 cracked ribs, a torn shoulder ligament. "You were lucky," he said. "I've seen people die from falls like that." I almost laughed. If only he'd heard what my family said before the ambulance arrived. They didn't come to the hospital. Not that afternoon. Not that evening. Not the next morning. The only message I received was from my wife. "Did you remember to feed Winston before you left?" Winston was our Labrador. Not once did she ask how I was. Only whether the dog had eaten. I stared at the message for several minutes, then locked my phone. For the first time in 39 years of marriage, I didn't reply. 2 days later, the hospital discharged me. I didn't call anyone for a ride. Instead, I took a taxi somewhere I hadn't visited since my father died. The old Harbor Street storage facility. Unit 214, the manager smiled when he saw me. "Mr. Calloway, it's been years, I know. I need my box." He disappeared into the back office and returned with a small steel container. The key was still taped beneath the handle, exactly where I'd left it. Inside were 3 things: a leather notebook, an old cassette recorder, and a thick envelope sealed with blue wax. I hadn't looked at any of them in almost 18 years, because I had promised someone I never would, unless I absolutely had to. Standing alone in that storage unit, I realized. That day had finally arrived. I picked up the envelope. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, were 8 words: "Open only after your family stops seeing you." My hands actually trembled, not because of the injury, because suddenly, the fall on the staircase didn't feel like the beginning of the story. It felt like something my father had been expecting, nearly 2 decades earlier. I broke the seal. Inside, the very first sentence made me forget the pain in my ribs. "If you're reading this, then the people living in your house have mistaken your kindness for permanent ownership." I expected my father's letter to contain advice. Instead, it contained instructions, not emotional ones, business instructions. The first page listed 12 addresses: warehouses, office buildings, industrial lots. Some I recognized, most I didn't. At the bottom was a single sentence: "These are the properties people think belong to me." I frowned. Think? I turned the page. "They never belonged to me. They belonged to the family holding company your grandfather created in 1958. For several moments, I simply stared. I had spent my entire life believing my father owned those properties outright. Apparently, he had spent decades making sure everyone believed exactly that. The third page explained why. When my grandfather built the company, he didn't trust inheritance. He trusted stewardship. Every generation received control. Only after proving they could protect the assets instead of exploiting them. There were no automatic heirs, no guaranteed ownership, only trustees, and every trustee had one responsibility: protect the family legacy from people who confused wealth with entitlement. I leaned back in the chair. My ribs hurt, but something hurt even more. I had completely forgotten that after my father died, the company's lawyers had asked me to attend a meeting. I declined. I was too overwhelmed planning the funeral. I signed several routine documents without reading most of them. Apparently, one of those signatures had quietly appointed me the sole trustee. My phone buzzed. "Melissa, 27 missed calls." Then a text. "Where are you?" Another. "The insurance company needs information." Another. "You can't disappear like this." Not once, Did she ask if I was recovering? I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Before leaving the storage facility, I played the old cassette. My father's voice filled the small concrete room. If you're hearing this, then you've finally stopped making excuses for people. I closed my eyes. You always believed love meant giving people another chance. I hope you're old enough now to understand. Sometimes giving them another chance simply teaches them you'll survive another betrayal. His voice paused, then came the sentence that changed everything. Go see Margaret Holloway. She'll already know why you've come. Margaret Holloway was 81. She had served as my grandfather's legal secretary before becoming corporate administrator for the family holding company. Most people assumed she retired years ago. She hadn't. She simply stopped working where anyone could find her. Her office occupied the second floor of an ordinary brick building above an antique bookstore. No sign, no advertisements, no receptionist. Just one brass plaque. Holloway Corporate Trustees. She opened the door before I even knocked. I've been wondering when you'd finally arrive. You knew I'd come? She smiled gently. Your father knew. I stepped inside. The office looked frozen in another decade. Wood filing cabinets, leather-bound ledgers, paper maps covering entire walls. Margaret motioned toward a conference table already covered with files. You've been very busy. She shook her head. No, your wife has. I looked up sharply. What? Margaret handed me several documents, mortgage applications, property searches, corporate registry requests, everyone submitted during the past 14 months, by Melissa, some under her own name, others through financial advisors. I don't understand. You will. Margaret slid another folder toward me. Inside was an application requesting appointment of a financial conservator. Applicant, Melissa Calloway. Reason, husband demonstrating cognitive decline following repeated falls and memory issues. I stared at the words. I know. It was denied. Why? Because the court requested medical evidence. There wasn't any. A cold silence settled over the room. Melissa hadn't laughed because I fell. She had already been preparing for the day I became incapable of saying no. The staircase had simply arrived earlier than she expected. Margaret folded her hands. Your father anticipated something like this. He left specific instructions. She unlocked another cabinet, removed a black binder, placed it directly in front of me. Across the cover were 4 words, Trustee Emergency Authority. I slowly opened it. The very first paragraph read, if the acting trustee reasonably believes family members are attempting to gain control through coercion, intimidation, or diminished capacity. I stopped reading, looked at Margaret. What happens then? She answered without hesitation. The trustee immediately removes every family member from financial control before they ever realize they've already lost it. For the first time since falling down those stairs, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about protection. Because suddenly, I understood something terrifying. My wife hadn't laughed because she thought I was weak. She laughed because she thought I was already defeated. I didn't activate the emergency authority that day, not because I doubted Melissa, because I wanted proof that couldn't be explained away. Margaret agreed. Good. Your grandfather used to say, never destroy someone's mask. Wait until they take it off themselves. I returned home the following afternoon. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the atmosphere felt strangely cheerful. Melissa was baking. My daughter, Chloe, was arranging flowers. The same people who hadn't visited me once in the hospital suddenly acted as though I'd been away on vacation. Melissa rushed over. Oh my goodness. You should have called. We were worried sick. I looked at her, really looked at her, not a single tear, not a trace of guilt. Only calculation. She hugged me carefully, avoiding my injured shoulder, not because she remembered it was hurt, because she had already seen the hospital discharge papers lying halfway out of my overnight bag. She wanted information, not reconciliation. Dinner that evening felt almost rehearsed. Melissa served my favorite pot roast. Chloe poured my coffee without being asked. Halfway through the meal, Melissa smiled sweetly. The hospital mentioned concussion symptoms. They said memory problems sometimes happen. I nodded. They can. She exchanged a quick glance with Chloe, then casually asked, You don't happen to remember where you put the Harbor Investments paperwork, do you? There it was. Not, how are your ribs? Not, does your head still hurt? The first serious question she asked after my accident was about paperwork. I smiled politely. I don't remember. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Over the next week, something fascinating happened. Melissa became the perfect wife, breakfast in bed, medication reminders, fresh flowers, evening walks. Anyone watching would have believed she had transformed overnight. Margaret laughed when I told her. People become incredibly affectionate when they think affection is an investment. 3 days later, I woke just after midnight. A strange sound echoed downstairs, metal very soft, almost like someone trying not to make noise. I quietly stepped into the hallway. The pain in my ribs reminded me to move slowly. The light beneath my study door was on. I never left it on. As I reached the doorway, I stopped. Melissa. She was kneeling beside my office safe. My office safe. She wasn't trying to open it. She was photographing the keypad. Then she carefully sprinkled baby powder across the buttons, watching which numbers held fingerprints. I remained perfectly silent. She smiled to herself, almost proudly, then she whispered, "Almost there." She had no idea I was standing 10 feet away. No idea I watched her wipe the powder away, take one final photograph, and quietly leave the room. I waited another minute before walking inside. The safe hadn't been opened. But now I knew something important. Melissa wasn't searching for money anymore. She was searching for control. The next morning, I replaced every lock on the safe, activated the trustee authority, transferred every trust document, property certificate, and banking authorization into trustee custody, not hidden, protected. By noon, no member of my family could access a single financial document without approval from the trustees. They didn't know it yet. Nothing in the house looked different. The paintings were still hanging. The safe was still bolted to the wall. The filing cabinets were still full. Only one thing had changed. Everything they thought they could eventually control had quietly disappeared overnight. 2 weeks later, Melissa made her move. She invited 3 people to our house, a neurologist, a private care consultant, and an attorney. I wasn't told about any of it. I simply walked into my own living room and found them already waiting. Melissa stood first. "Honey, we're only worried about you." The neurologist smiled politely. "We'd like to perform a short cognitive assessment." I looked around the room, then at Chloe. She couldn't even meet my eyes. Finally, I looked at Melissa. "So, this is what the staircase was really about." She froze. "What? You weren't hoping I'd recover. You were hoping I'd become incompetent." The room became painfully quiet. The attorney slowly closed his briefcase. Melissa forced a nervous laugh. "Don't be ridiculous." I calmly removed a single envelope from my jacket, not from my safe, not from my house, from the trustee's office. Across the front were 5 words. "Notice of Trustee Protection Order." I placed it on the coffee table. The attorney picked it up first. His face drained of color before he'd even finished the first page. Melissa noticed. "What is it?" He looked directly at her, then quietly asked the question she never expected to hear. "Mrs. Calloway, exactly when did your husband become the acting trustee?" Melissa stared at the attorney. "I asked you a question." He ignored her. Instead, he slowly placed the trustee document back onto the coffee table, as though it had suddenly become fragile. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Calloway, has the emergency authority already been activated?" 10 days ago. The room went silent. The neurologist quietly closed his notebook. He suddenly understood he wasn't witnessing a medical consultation. He was sitting inside a legal disaster. Melissa forced another smile. "I don't understand any of this." "No," the attorney replied. "I don't think you do." He opened the document again. "Mrs. Calloway, as of 10 days ago, you no longer have authority to access any trust records, any investment accounts, any corporate documents, or any property governed by the Calloway Family Holding Trust." Melissa frowned. "What trust?" Exactly. She had spent years trying to gain control of wealth without ever understanding what she was trying to control. And Chloe spoke for the first time. "Dad, please, we were only trying to make sure you were safe." I looked at her quietly. "Were you?" She lowered her eyes. "You stood on the staircase while your mother laughed. You watched strangers carry me into an ambulance. You never visited. You never called. But suddenly, "You're worried about my health?" She couldn't answer because there wasn't one. Melissa's confidence finally disappeared. She turned toward the attorney. "There has to be a mistake. My husband owns everything." The attorney slowly shook his head. "No, he manages everything. Those are very different things." She blinked. "What?" He opened another page. "The properties, the investment companies, the commercial portfolio, they belong to the Calloway Family Holding Trust. They have never been your husband's personal assets. He has only served as trustee." Melissa looked as though the room had tilted beneath her. "So, if he dies," the attorney interrupted gently, "the trustees appoint another trustee. They do not distribute the assets." Her face went completely white. Everything she had quietly been planning, every financial calculation, every conversation about inheritance, had been built on an assumption that had never been true. I stood slowly. My ribs still hurt, but for the first time in weeks, the pain no longer mattered. I walked toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace, removed a framed photograph. It showed my grandfather, my father, and me, 3 generations. Behind the glass was a folded piece of paper. I removed it carefully. "My grandfather wrote this in 1964. I handed it to the attorney. He smiled after reading the first sentence, then read it aloud. "Family wealth exists to protect future generations, not to reward the first generation that becomes greedy enough to steal it." Melissa sank into the sofa. She finally understood. The staircase hadn't cost her an inheritance. Her choices had. Within a month, I filed for divorce, not because she laughed, not because she ignored me at the hospital, because trust had already died long before I ever fell down those stairs. The court proceedings were surprisingly short. Melissa demanded half of everything. Then the trust attorneys produced nearly 70 years of legal records. Judge after judge reached the same conclusion. The trust had never been marital property. It couldn't be divided. She left the courtroom with exactly what the law entitled her to. Nothing more. Chloe didn't speak to me for almost 6 months. Then one rainy afternoon, she appeared alone. No Melissa, no excuses. She simply stood on my porch holding a cardboard box. I found these while helping Mom move. Inside were every birthday card I'd ever given her, every handmade Christmas ornament from elementary school, every photograph she'd drawn on with crayons as a little girl. She looked ashamed. Mom was throwing them away. I carefully picked up one tiny paper angel she'd made in 2nd grade. "You kept these?" "For 30 years. She started crying. "I became someone I don't recognize." I nodded. "I know, I don't expect forgiveness. I know." She looked around the quiet house. "I miss my dad." I smiled sadly. "I've been here the whole time." 2 years later, the Calloway Foundation opened its first rehabilitation center for elderly victims of financial exploitation and family abuse. Not lawyers, not bankers, real counselors, medical advocates, emergency housing, people who understood that abuse doesn't always leave bruises people can see. Near the entrance stood a simple bronze plaque. It didn't carry my name, it carried my father's. Beneath it were the words he had written decades earlier. "Kindness without boundaries becomes permission." Every person who walked through those doors read that sentence. Some nodded, some cried. Every one of them understood it. As for me, I still avoided that staircase, not because I feared falling again, but because every time I looked at those steps, I remembered something far more important than the pain. I remembered the exact moment I stopped trying to save people who were perfectly willing to destroy me. And that, more than any trust, any building, or any fortune, became the greatest inheritance I could ever leave behind.